welcome to Love Life with Dr. Babe. We're hanging out at Whiskey Mist with some of my friends today to talk about spirituality, morality, and religion. So brace yourselves. We're going to be exploring whether concepts such as good and evil are objective, how we should apply them, how they coexist, and whether they change over time, or otherwise, is there a better way to define or label good and evil to understand its application from a more humanistic perspective? Or does good and evil actually exist at all? We're really going for it today, so you're not going to want to leave that couch or computer until the end. In fact, I hope you have someone to process this show with afterwards, because it's going to be a doozy. So let me introduce you to my guests. We have with us today Alissandra Mariani, Badir Awe, and Yanni Ebanks. I invited them here today so that we would have a diverse discussion from varied perspectives. Badir has been on the show before. He has a degree in theology, so I expect he will be speaking from a more traditional Christian perspective, but we never know. And then we have Alissandra, and I know her from yoga. She may be speaking with about that more alternative spirituality perspective. And Yanni, I completely respect you and your intellectual dynamics, so I think that you can bring another different kind of context to the show. So we never know where we're going to go. Let's get started. Welcome to each of you. Badir, let me ask you first. Could you kind of give us more of a traditional Christian definition of what good and evil is?
I mean, I guess, obviously, speaking from a moral point of view and a personal point of view, in terms of whether somebody is harmed or injured unfairly, unethically. I think that's just an easy way to see what we might consider good and evil.
Okay. What about you, Yannis? Do you believe in good and evil?
Yes. I believe in it to the extent that my definition would be that good and evil. Evil can be regarded as something that is harmful to us, to humans. I think that, ultimately, what is our shared goal in life? It would vary from individual to individual, but I think ultimately we all look for happiness, and that can come in many forms, and the absence of happiness could be regarded as evil.
So similarly to a little bit what Badir was saying about harming versus maybe helping or something, creating that goodness between people or having that unity perhaps?
Yes.
I know these are really big concepts that we're going to have to sort of take our time to get the nitty-gritty of what we're trying to say, but I thought it would be interesting to identify whether, one, you do sort of have varied perspectives, or maybe there are more similarities than we assume coming from your varied backgrounds. What about you, Ali? Do you feel like good and evil exists, and how would you define it?
I do. I define it as light and dark, light and darkness. I definitely agree with the idea of harming others to be more categorized with something evil. But I also think it's important to recognize that evil, or the way that I put it, darkness, can also be internal. Maybe when it comes to our choices or the way that we feel about ourselves. That is kind of my concept.
How can we use these concepts maybe to guide us or not in our lives, in our choices?
I think our consequences, the consequences, to maybe by traveling either one road or the other, good, evil, light, dark, kind of, it's almost like which fire will you feed? If you head down one way, you may attract all things in the same direction.
Okay, so the consequences of things. I'm wondering what Badir thinks about that from more of a religious background.
Well, I think it all sounds kind of similar to what we're saying.
Yeah.
I think to just throw something else in there, the obvious other religious viewpoint of good and evil is taking the belief in God and the faith in God, and therefore having traditionally some sort of rules by which God has imposed on humanity to help them guide through their lives. So that's maybe another alternative way to look at good and evil, that these two may not necessarily believe in some sort of arbitrarily imposed rules by a deity, whether it exists or not.
So, I mean, yeah, we have to bring God into the conversation. I think that's important. But in regards to the purpose of the concepts of good and evil, this you feel is supposed to guide humans as to what they should be doing or shouldn't be doing?
I think it's an innate thing at the end of the day. I think a lot of it is innate, a lot of it is black and white. There's some areas where it's gray and no one's really sure what's good and what's evil. I mean, I guess that's just life. I tend to look at good and evil, though, from a biological perspective as well. For me, life is good and anti-life is evil. So from the beginning of evolutionary history, you've had life just trying to grow, and you've had death fighting against it. So it's good and evil living together across this journey, and they're constantly in struggle against each other. And of course, you know, that leads to the notion of some sort of eternal realm where good is completely separated from evil, and they're no longer together, but they still exist. I like that. That kind of makes sense for me, biologically, physically.
Okay, interesting. But I see Yanni thinking over there. What's going on in your mind? What's coming up for you?
Just trying to process all the different angles, because as simple as good versus evil might sound, it's actually very, you know, when you delve into, I think we're getting very philosophical here. When you try to analyze it from these different perspectives, it becomes very complex. But as we know, life is only as complicated as we humans make it. So again, I mean, I think it's difficult to explain good and evil, right and wrong, in the absence of religion, because I mean, I'll keep the perspective more local. We've all grown up with some sort of religious orientation, whether we practice it nowadays or not. And for me personally, even though I don't practice any specific religion, I'm still grateful for that orientation, which helped guide me along the way in life. But in an attempt to simplify it, again, I think that we could, as a moral compass, we could simply say that, you know, if it's harmful to ourselves, or if it's harmful to someone else, because, you know, sometimes we do act selfishly, then it could be regarded, I think evil is a strong word.
Yeah.
But evil can come in so many different forms.
Yeah.
Badir and I were talking last night, whereas I was focusing more on right versus wrong and good and bad, you know, I had completely ignored suffering and pain and illness, and those could also be regarded as forms of evil.
Right. I mean, I think it brings up the idea philosophically of, are these things actually opposites or not? Are they actually two sides of the same coin? And when you were talking about sort of non-life, death being evil and life being good, I'm thinking, how can you have one without the other? How can one be so divisively opposite from good to evil? So it's the same thing with good and bad, positive and negative. I mean, we were even talking before sort of about the topic and what we were trying to, the messages that we would like to put across, and really seeing it as something that is in tandem, something that is part of a more holistic whole. And we can't really separate one or have one without the other. And I know that was something that you were referring to as well. Is that something that's salient for you?
Definitely.
How so?
Well, I don't know. Having this conversation and hearing the word evil over and over is kind of giving me this perspective. As I was saying earlier, like, I stopped using the word completely. I think when we label something as evil, there's really no room for growth. And whether it's evil in the biological sense, I like that you were just speaking about, I get a different kind of feeling from it than when I do when we think of this, of evil today. Maybe because of all the concepts or, stereotypes that have gone alongside the word. But
Is there anything that we can think of that would be sort of evil that we would agree to, do you think?
Well, I think why we're scared of the word evil is because it comes with that judgment behind it, and we don't want to judge, so I think that's kind of what's holding us back a bit. I mean, is that kind of...
Sort of. I mean, but then we go back to the whole, when we do discuss God, and we discuss the deity, isn't that what we're taught, to not judge? No judgment?
Yeah.
So,
Go ahead, sorry.
yeah, no, to even say that is evil, isn't that whole judgment in itself something that is evil? I don't know.
And philosophically, it's really hard to not judge. I mean, we come from a lens, a perspective. As a human being, we're a machine that has to perceive. So inherently, there is some level of judgment. I mean, as a therapist too, like my role is to be non-judgmental, but given the context of being a human being in a subjective world. So when we talk about these things, what could we label as evil and sort of have the most agreement on? I can only think about from my personal professional experiences, like the stories that I hear that are horrific and traumatic, and I even use the word evil at times when I'm talking to clients who have experienced extreme trauma or some kind of, episode or experience where it's almost like they feel like they've come to a place where they've confronted the concepts of good and evil by feeling that energy. And I don't know, before I sort of share anything, like if there's anything that you guys have experienced too, if maybe it's just me, or have any of you come close to contacting that kind of energy in your lifetime?
Absolutely. But I think if you go your lifetime constantly labeling whatever happened as evil, you kind of live this anger path in a sense. So the way that I kind of look at evil or darkness is almost like a lack of knowledge, a lack of a greater wisdom, a lack of understanding the self, and a lack of compassion.
And, even from my perspective as a therapist, I can also do therapy with people who may have at one time or another been considered evildoers, right? And so I like to focus on the behavior, the choices. So it's not necessarily the person is evil, but the choice that they've made is coming from that negative energetic source. And so when you do that, you can find compassion for the source of evil doing, if that makes sense. And then that compassion allows you to then see them as injured or lacking that positive goodness, and so they can have the opportunity to change, and then they have the option of what they want to be, good or evil. But ultimately, I think choice is also a big factor. What about for either of you? Do you feel like you've ever come in contact with evil energy or negative energy to a point where even like toxic people or friendships, and sometimes we like say we need distance from that because it just feels icky? That might be another way to describe it.
Yeah, or I can think of feelings of resentment towards either a family member or from a previous relationship.
And I definitely don't want to focus on the bad stuff, right? We can talk about the good stuff too. When have you ever felt like blasts of positive energy and joy where you really feel optimistic about life and whatever is out there and that you believe in? Like when you touch that, what is that like? Is that magical? I mean, what would you describe it as? Is it just goodness? Is it something else for you?
I like to think that that's everyday practice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that ultimately that's what, I think we can all agree on what makes us unhappy. Happiness for each of us may be different, but we can definitely, I think we can agree on a collective unhappiness in the sense that whether we call it evil, bad, what have you, but it could be regarded as objective to that extent.
If it's collective, is that what you're saying?
if we can all agree on what unhappiness looks like, then I think that, going back to your point about whether it's objective or not, to your question whether it's objective or not.
Okay. Badir, I have a question for you. How would you distinguish between religion, spirituality, and morality?
Carefully.
All right, so let's give it a go. You're on the hot seat.
Well, I think you lower in vagueness when you come down. Religion is more specific. You'll have rules and regulations. Morality, not as many rules, not as many regulations, but still a little bit. And then spirituality becomes a little vaguer. Like, what are we talking about? Spirituality? Can I feel anything? You know, when we're talking about spirituality. So for me, they all exist within each other, and they're all together, but they kind of spiral downwards, and spirituality is just a lot more vague, whereas religion has attempted to codify morality and spirituality. That's why it has a bad name, because they're the ones with the rules of religion, right? Nobody wants to be told what to do or what not to do.
I disagree. I think a lot of people want to be told what to do. Sorry to, put you on the spot.
Well, you're right. I mean, look how many religious people there are in the world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think people sometimes need that because when they think for themselves, this gray area that we're trying to expose is so overwhelming to maneuver that I think it's just they get paralyzed in fear. Either they want to sort of just subscribe to something that's given to them so they don't have to think about it. They can kind of go on automatic pilot and just sort of rest assured they're doing the right thing. Or maybe, I don't know, it could be other complicated reasons, but I think that there are lots of people that do opt for that because they're missing something in their lives, and that brings them purpose. Or, like I said, that, they get overwhelmed by the shades of gray, which is what I call it, like this subjective morality. I think a lot of times we talk about what is right and wrong and good and bad, and we expect people to sort of just decide on an instant what would be the right thing to do. But given, our personal background and the situation, there are so many different ethical routes to take. And I think it was you, Yanni, that was talking about hurting people, or maybe it was Badir. I don't know if that's the only way to define what is bad or wrong, because somebody usually always gets hurt. So if you went around life not trying to hurt anybody, I don't know if you'd make any choices.
What keeps coming to me is that, on a grander scale, and I don't have any one-sided opinion, but what about wars and innocent people getting hurt and people that are starving when other people, have everything? Now I don't know, and I'm asking, would you consider that evil? Is that an evil force? The imbalance that actually leaves people.
And the other question that comes to mind as well is, life is ultimately, it's an inheritance, because you're a child, or you're parented, if I can use that as a verb, for so long, but you don't make any of those decisions. The decisions are made for you, and you inherit whatever practice, whatever customs, whatever beliefs, for the most part, for a greater part of your life, and then you finally inherit freedom, some degree of freedom, and then you start to, but then you've already processed and been conditioned and been indoctrinated, whatever you want to call it. So it's,
I think as much as we want to learn in this lifetime, the key is kind of unlearning everything and then learning all over again.
yeah.
Now that we know that we have the freedom to think, to do whatever really we want in some way.
Do you think a lot of people take that opportunity to lose themselves to then find what is actually true for them?
I think so. I think there's a middle. There's a middle, because even if you do that yourself, you will start to find people that are doing the same. You know, once you start questioning, you encounter people that are questioning.
Yeah, like attracts like.
Yeah.
But I think the minority of people do it. You know, you said to lose yourself, that's a classic Jesus quote. To find yourself, you must lose yourself. And apparently that path is a small path and no one really treads it.
Right.
Right? So I think most people probably don't, because it's a dangerous journey to lose yourself and your preconceived notions and to step out of that. And there's perils and fear that you have to confront to do it. And most people would just be like, nah, I'm not going there.
Unknown.
Yeah.
It's the unknown.
I'll stay right here. Comfort zone always.
But that's probably a similarity between spiritual paths and religious paths then, because I think if that's a common ground, it's really just one mode of getting to the same place in the end, and whatever fits for that person. Like if the religious structure works for one, but then maybe the other person likes the lack of structure and the ambiguity of spirituality. I don't know, you didn't get a chance to really define spirituality because Badir did.
I mean, same thing, definitions. It's almost like I've unlearned them. I've had this last few months of my life.
Yeah.
I don't know what religion is. I don't know what spirituality would be considered. Am I spiritual? I don't know. I know what I believe in. I know, you know, who I talk to when I wake up in the morning and who I talk to when I go to bed. And you and I, or all of us can have that one thing in common. It's the foundation, it's the base.
I think it takes a lot of courage to say that, though. You know, I think a lot of people don't feel comfortable to say they don't know or that they don't choose, or they have to label it as whether it's agnostic or whatever, you know?
Yeah, but
So-
for sure.
That's just the society we live in, and you know, it's always. I don't know why I mean, I do, but I don't agree with placing humans in a box. Like we all need to be categorized.
It's limiting.
Yeah, whether it's racially, culturally, linguistically. I mean, linguistically makes sense, but
Culturally doesn't, genetically doesn't. I mean, I think you can paint people in boxes, but they cannot be contained in that box.
right.
But there is categories
That's
to
roots.
everything.
That's roots, right?
Yeah.
So-
You can't deny your roots.
Okay.
You can't deny where you come from. But to try and say that this is where I come from, so this is what I do, and this is what I believe, and that is more
Yes.
box.
As if you can't
Thank
break
you.
out of that
Right.
box.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, we're individuals. Yes, culture and genetics, etc., shape us, but
Yeah, I'm just thinking about, you know, the question of what are you or where are you from is actually not that simple. Sometimes it's a very complicated one. And
who are you?
yeah.
That's
Go
a better
by.
question.
You know, these are all very complicated things. So I think that, I don't know, they're not as easy as we think to define them. I go by many names, so it depends on what context you ask me.
Hey, Dr.
Tell me
Babe.
whatever you want. Yeah. In this one, Dr. Babe works. So, you know, we only have a few more minutes, so I'm just wondering if there's anything that's really important for you, like a message to get across about what you believe or what you'd like people to consider in their ideas of what is right and wrong, or what is, you know, what is morality, what is spirituality, what are the important points that you want to pass on? Badir, you have so much wealth of knowledge. I know that we almost thought that you would take over this whole show.
For me, it was what I said earlier, the balance of good and evil. But I think really quickly, to make a clarification, we were talking about judgment and the harsh connotations behind that, but I don't think that's necessarily true. I think condemnation is the better word. I think you can still judge something to be good or evil, but then whether you condemn or not is a different story. So just to throw that out there. But the thing that I really, really believe about good and evil is that they coexist. They have always coexisted, and they always will coexist. And I think that has application in society, and even Cayman society, because a lot of times we hear people are disappointed when some evil happens, some murder or some other thing. And at the end of the day, people make judgments about Cayman society saying, oh no, well, it's an evil society because this is happening. Well, no, good and evil always coexist. And I know we had the conversation, we didn't make it happen today, but I believe though they intensify throughout time.
Absolutely.
Good becomes more intensified, and so does evil. And that's why we have the technological and intellectual achievement to make a nuclear bomb, which in itself is good, but obviously it can be used for bad.
Yeah.
So that's just kind of my thing. Good and evil, they coexist in my body. I feel it, you know, in everyday life. Driving a car is good, but the evil is that you could crash. Like, that's just my
Right.
thing.
Bad things happen.
Coexistence of good and evil.
Yes.
God, devil, Christ, antichrist. There's a million examples.
Sure, and I think it's also about how we respond to things. You know, if you want to consider them as mistakes or limitations or weaknesses, right? We all have weaknesses. So it's what do you do once you recognize? Do you even have a moment of recollection and remorse when you do those things? Or do you just, you know,
Right.
you're like a sociopath
Right.
who doesn't have that empathy?
Right. It's awareness. I think, you know, if there's a message to get across, it's practice awareness and ask questions. And whether you act on the questions or not that you're asking, whether you have discussions about them with other people.
But I think consequences and rules do play an important part, right? Because ultimately, we can't always know, okay, well, if I do this, I'm going to go to jail. Or if I do this, there's going to be some kind of consequence to it. So it does sort of regulate certain behaviors in our society
Yeah.
that are agreed upon. But really, laws and rules are compromises, I think, that are made to suit the, you know, the average population.
To create order.
Yeah, exactly. But does that mean it's good or bad, right or wrong?
I think it goes back to discussing, you know, who are you hurting? Who are you hurting? And
Maybe why? Does that play in?
Why?
But it,
Why are you hurting someone?
I think that's more for the self, though. Who are you hurting, and are you
Yes.
going to hurt someone?
Yes.
I mean, yeah.
And sometimes when you pose that question to yourself, you won't find the answer right away. Sometimes you really have to think, because, you know, a simple action like a harsh response, sometimes we chalk it up to something very superficial, but when you take a moment to really reflect and delve into your awareness, you realize that it actually goes deeper, and there's actually some deeper healing or some deeper awareness that needs to be tapped into.
Well, I think we've established that there are a lot of vague concepts that are very important, and I think having a discussion like this is really, really essential. And having diverse viewpoints come together to have a reasonable, respectable
But still one.
dialogue. Yeah, exactly. There's a lot more similarities, I think, amongst us than there are differences. So
Yes.
thank you for coming and joining us on
Thank
this
you.
conversation.
Thank you.
I hope to see you all again and have some more conversations when we're out and about. We don't have to reserve this type of dialogue for a TV show.
We could go at
Cool.
length.
Yes. So thank you all for watching and tuning in here at Whiskey Mist for Love Life with Dr. Babe. We've been exploring good and evil, right and wrong, and spirituality, morality, and religion. So hope you were paying attention and that you take some time to think about all of these very vague and ambiguous concepts that are really important to us. Bye-bye.